My ex-husband's new wife stood on my porch with a greedy smirk that could sour milk and said the words that would twist my life into a storm. "We're taking our share of your father's estate. Pack your things and leave." She laughed in my face as if my pain were a joke she had rehearsed in front of a mirror. And in that moment, I felt something deeper than grief, something that mixed humiliation with anger until it burned behind my ribs like firewood catching a spark. Before I go on, let me just say this. If you've ever had someone stand at your door and treat you like you don't matter, then you already know the weight pressing on my chest that day. If you're here with me listening, your support means everything. A quick like or even a simple comment helps me keep telling stories like this, and I can't tell you enough how much that matters. Thank you, truly. I'm Rebecca Lawson, 33 years old, a bookkeeper at the marina in Savannah. I'm the kind of woman who balances ledgers with a pencil instead of fancy software, waters my porch ferns before I water myself, and still believes in sending handwritten thank you cards. I thought I knew what trouble looked like. I thought it came with warning signs, little cracks you could see forming before the wall collapsed. But trouble didn't knock politely at my door. It arrived wearing too much perfume and smiling like she already owned the land under my feet. The morning had started with the smell of coffee and the sound of gulls fighting over scraps near the dock, the kind of simple rhythm that kept me steady since Dad passed. His house, this house, wasn't grand, but it held his laughter in the floorboards and his wisdom in the walls. He'd built the little bait shop out back with his own 2 hands, and I could still picture him sanding the wood, humming off-key while I brought him lemonade. To me, this was sacred ground. To Tiffany, the woman standing smug on my porch, it was just another piece of property she thought she could pluck like a ripe peach. I stared at her, remembering the last time I saw her before the funeral. She had worn black like it was a fashion statement, not a sign of respect, and she'd spent more time checking her phone than speaking a kind word. And yet here she was, suddenly the voice of entitlement, telling me to pack my things like I was some tenant behind on rent. I wanted to slam the door, I wanted to shout, but something inside me told me to breathe instead. So I memorized that smirk, the way it curled like spoiled cream, and I tucked it away in a corner of my mind where I keep things I plan to deal with later. Tiffany's laughter echoed as she stepped off the porch, her heels clacking against the wood like a warning shot. Mark, my ex-husband, stood at the edge of the driveway pretending to look at his phone, too cowardly to meet my eyes. Once upon a time, I had loved that man, believed his promises, and built a future on his shaky foundation. But looking at him now, all I saw was weakness dressed in a button-up shirt. He had traded me in for a younger model who thought cruelty was a hobby, and together they thought they could muscle me out of what was mine. The screen door creaked as I closed it slowly behind me. Inside, the house felt different, like Tiffany's laughter had slipped under the doorframe and settled in the air. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the cup of coffee I hadn't finished, the steam gone cold, and I felt the tears threaten. But I didn't let them fall. Grief had already stolen enough from me. I wasn't about to give it the satisfaction of seeing me collapse over a smirk and a threat. Instead, I thought of Dad. He used to say that manners and strength weren't enemies. He told me that kindness didn't mean letting people walk all over you, and that sometimes standing tall with a calm voice was louder than shouting from the rooftops. I could almost hear him, sitting across from me, reminding me that we Lawsons don't scare easy, even when the world thinks we should. So I picked up my ledger, the same one I used to balance the marina accounts, and I wrote Tiffany's name at the top of a blank page. Underneath it, I wrote one word in neat block letters: debt. Not money, not property. The kind of debt that builds when you laugh in someone's face and think they'll never fight back. I didn't know how I would settle it yet, but I knew one thing. I wasn't packing my things, and I wasn't leaving my father's house. The rest of the day passed in a fog of small chores and bigger thoughts. I swept the porch as if sweeping away Tiffany's perfume, folded laundry as if each shirt held a piece of my backbone, and cooked dinner, even though my appetite was thin. With every task, I felt a quiet resolve building, like bricks stacking one by one. They thought I was weak because I was grieving, because I was alone, because I was the woman left behind. But grief has a way of sharpening you, of teaching you that once you've survived the worst loss, you're not so easily scared by paperwork and threats. That night, I sat by the window and watched the sun sink into the marsh. The sky turned peach and lavender, colors my father always loved, and I whispered to him in the silence. I told him I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I promised him I wouldn't let anyone trample what he built. The water rippled, like it heard me, and for the first time since he passed, I felt a flicker of strength warm my chest. I went to bed with Tiffany's smirk burned into my memory and Mark's cowardice etched into my patience. The house groaned softly as if reminding me it had weathered worse storms. I pulled the quilt up to my chin and closed my eyes, knowing that the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. It didn't take long before Tiffany turned her smirk into action, and within days my inbox began to fill with the kind of messages that could sour anyone's spirit, each one dressed up to look polite, but dripping with venom, and always sent at the most inconvenient times, as if she enjoyed catching me off balance. Her emails full of so-called caregiving invoices, with hours and dates that twisted the truth, claims that my father had owed them money for consulting work Mark supposedly provided, and spreadsheets so bloated with formulas and invented figures that they would have made sense only to someone who believed numbers could be stretched like taffy without snapping. And though I tried to brush them off at first, each new message felt like a paper cut across skin already raw with grief. I told myself to stay calm and reasonable, that surely this storm would pass if I held my ground with manners and patience, because I had grown up believing that politeness could be stronger than hostility. Yet the more I tried to meet her games with grace, the more brazen she became, dropping off certified envelopes at my door with typed-out demands, and even managing to get a lawyer to draft a so-called agreement that would have me vacate the property in 30 days. A proposal so absurd I had to laugh even while my stomach twisted, because deep down I knew that lies written in formal language could still trap you if you weren't careful, and I could already feel how dangerously close I was to being pushed into a corner I had no intention of occupying. The contrast between the life I had shared with Dad and the one I faced now struck me hardest in the quietest moments, because where I once woke each morning to the smell of his strong coffee and the comfort of cinnamon toast, now the house smelled of ink and stale toner, of paper and threats piling on my table, and I realized how quickly a home could turn from sanctuary into battlefield when greed painted a target on its walls. Yet even in those moments of fear, I tried to cling to fragments of humor, like the time I carried a plate of fresh banana bread to a tense meeting with Tiffany and Mark in a misguided attempt to soften the tension. Because in the South, even battles are laced with sugar, but Tiffany never touched a slice. And that was when I knew for sure she was dangerous, since anyone who refuses banana bread with walnuts is either allergic or heartless, and she never mentioned an allergy. Still, despite the heaviness pressing against me, I found a stubborn ember of defiance sparking each time I reread those documents, because no matter how polished they looked, I could see the fingerprints of desperation smudged across the pages, and I began to understand that what Tiffany and Mark were doing wasn't just cruel but sloppy, a mix of arrogance and laziness that assumed I would never question them. And while my heart still ached from Dad's absence and my nights were restless with worry, my mind started to sharpen in ways I hadn't expected, preparing me for the moment when I would stop playing defense and begin looking for cracks in their carefully painted story, the kind of cracks that grow into openings if you know where to press. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, the surface barely visible beneath the sea of papers Tiffany had so generously and maliciously supplied, and instead of letting them tower over me like a wall of threats, I decided to see them for what they truly were, sheets of paper filled with numbers and claims, and numbers were a language I had always understood better than spoken words. a language that had no tone or mockery, only balance and truth. And as I ran my finger down the first invoice, tracing the columns like I used to do with Dad's old ledger at the bait shop, I noticed something so small it could have been missed, yet it hit me like a crack of lightning, because on the very day Tiffany had claimed to spend 24 hours providing round-the-clock care, her smiling face had been posted online, cocktail in hand, sunlight bouncing off her sunglasses in Miami, her captions full of hashtags about oceans and freedom, and in that instant the heaviness that had clung to my shoulders for weeks loosened just a little, because I had finally spotted what every liar eventually leaves behind: footprints leading straight out of the story they tried to build. I pulled another sheet from the stack, my pulse quickening now, not with fear, but with a kind of feverish focus, and I saw another detail that made my breath catch: a bill listing treatment supposedly performed by a physician who had not only retired, but had moved to Arizona years earlier, his office door locked and his name removed from the state medical registry, which meant that Tiffany wasn't just careless, she was bold enough to resurrect ghosts to pad her fiction. And while part of me wanted to throw my head back and laugh, another part whispered that this was more serious than I had dared to admit, because forgery wasn't a game of paper cuts. It was a felony with teeth, and as I shuffled through the stack, I felt the fear that had caged me begin to melt into something far more useful. The beginnings of curiosity mixed with determination. And for the first time since Tiffany's smirk on my porch, I felt the shift of power begin, tiny and fragile, but undeniably real. As the night deepened and the lamp cast its yellow glow across the table, I noticed something that struck closer to the bone than the fabricated invoices, because there, across two different documents, supposedly created months apart, was Mark's handwriting, the familiar curve of his R that I had once teased him about when we were newly married, telling him it looked like a fisherman's hook, and that same exact hook, identical down to the hesitation mark of the pen and even the faint margin smudge from a printer that had clearly been out of alignment, appeared on both forms as if copy-pasted. And in that moment, my heart clenched with the bitter recognition that the man I once loved, the man I had cooked for and believed in, was now so reckless and so complicit in Tiffany's greed that he could not even bother to disguise his own sloppiness. And although it hurt to see him exposed in such a pathetic light, it also strengthened me, because careless enemies are easier to defeat, and they had just handed me the first thread of the rope I would use to unravel their scheme. The thought of unraveling led me to remember Miss Alvarez, my father's dear friend, a woman whose quiet strength was legendary in our small community. Known for her soft voice that could cut through noise with more authority than shouting ever could, and as I pictured her tidy office with its neatly stacked case files and the steady hum of her old clock, I knew in my bones that she was the person I needed, someone who understood that law was not just about rules, but about fairness, someone who could take my fragile discoveries and weave them into something unbreakable. And as I carefully gathered the pages into a folder, labeling them with Dad's handwriting style out of habit, I realized I no longer felt completely alone, because I had the beginnings of evidence, the whisper of a plan, and the memory of my father telling me that when storms come, you don't run. You set your feet and face the wind. And as I laid the folder down beside me, I felt a new kind of fire steadying inside me, soft but certain, and I knew that grief would still visit me in the night, but it would no longer rule me, because hope had finally found a seat at my table. The next morning I rose earlier than usual, the sky still painted in bruised shades of lavender and gray, and I felt the kind of restless energy that comes not from peace, but from the stirring of a plan beginning to take shape. Because once you spot cracks in a wall, you cannot help but imagine how the whole structure might eventually crumble. And so I made myself a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the dead and set about pulling out every folder, box, and notebook that my father had ever tucked away in the house, determined to find in his careful records the truth that Tiffany and Mark, thought they could bury under their fraud. And as I spread his papers across the dining table, I could almost see his handwriting guiding me, neat block letters and tidy margins, the habits of a man who believed that order in small things was the foundation of fairness in life. And that belief gave me the calmness I needed to start piecing together the evidence with a clear mind. I sorted through bank statements, old tax returns, canceled checks, even receipts for fishing supplies that Dad had labeled with strips of painter's tape. And the more I sifted, the more I felt surrounded not just by paper but by his presence, as if each document carried his quiet voice reminding me that truth has weight even when lies shout louder. And as I created small piles and cross-referenced them with Tiffany's invoices, the holes in her claims grew so wide you could have steered a shrimp boat through them, because dates didn't match, amounts shifted without reason, and signatures appeared with uncanny similarity that no genuine life ever produces. And I felt a sharp satisfaction in knowing that their arrogance had blinded them to the simplest fact, that real life is messy, records scatter, handwriting varies, but lies always try too hard to be perfect, and perfection in paperwork is the biggest giveaway of all. By midday, I carried my neat folder to Miss Alvarez's office, a narrow brick building near the courthouse with ivy crawling up its side. And as soon as I stepped in, I felt steadier, because the air inside carried a kind of authority mixed with comfort, the scent of lemon polish on wood and the faint tick of the wall clock that had probably been counting down the seconds of justice for decades. And when she greeted me with her warm eyes and calm voice, I felt something shift again, because here was someone who had seen every trick in the book and yet still believed in fairness. And as I laid out the folder on her desk, she listened without interruption, only nodding slowly. And then she pulled out her reading glasses and began to flip through the papers with a concentration that made my chest unclench for the first time in weeks. And when she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of a hammer wrapped in velvet. She told me my father's trust had included a no-contest clause, one strong enough to strip anyone of their share the moment they tried to claim it falsely. And even more, it carried an automatic referral to the district attorney for fraud, which meant Tiffany's greed wasn't just laughable, it was dangerous to herself. I walked out of her office with the late afternoon sun on my shoulders and a new rhythm in my step, because I knew now that Tiffany and Mark had set their own trap without realizing it, and all I had to do was let them walk deeper into it. But that didn't mean I would sit idly by. So I spent evenings poring over more files, learning to love the smell of paper and ink as if they were weapons instead of clutter. Brewing coffee so strong I joked to myself it could grow chest hair, and scribbling notes in margins like battle plans. Because for the first time since my father's funeral, I felt a sense of control. Not complete, not overwhelming, but enough to steady me. And as I stood at the window one night looking out at the marsh, reflecting the moonlight, I whispered to myself that kindness was not weakness and silence was not surrender. And I promised that when the time came, I would meet Tiffany's smirk not with anger or tears, but with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had done her homework and knew the ending before the other players even saw the board. Over the next week, I found myself living two lives. One where I still kept the books for the marina, smiled politely at neighbors, and tried to keep the plants on the porch from wilting in the southern heat, and another where I became a quiet detective, piecing together a web of lies that Tiffany and Mark had spun with such arrogance that they truly believed no one would bother to check. And in this second life, my nights stretched long under the yellow glow of my desk lamp as I cross-referenced documents, printing screenshots from Tiffany's social media and comparing them against dates in her invoices, discovering again and again that she had placed herself in two different places at once, sometimes at a poolside party in Miami, while supposedly administering round-the-clock care to my father, sometimes attending a boutique opening in Atlanta on the very evening she billed for overnight stays by his side. And though each discovery tightened my chest with anger, It also filled me with the steady thrill of someone watching a tower lean ever so slightly before it begins to fall. With every page I examined, I uncovered another thread, and soon the picture grew clearer, because not only did their lies multiply, but they became lazy, and laziness is a gift to anyone willing to look closely. And I noticed invoices repeating line items, word for word with only dates swapped, a pattern so mechanical it screamed of a copy-paste job. And when I checked the timestamps on certain emails Mark had sent, they matched perfectly with times the bank was closed, meaning transactions he claimed to have witnessed couldn't have been verified at all. And it was in these moments that I realized arrogance had become their downfall, because in their rush to grab what was not theirs, they had forgotten that the truth has a stubborn way of shining through the smallest cracks, and those cracks were now spreading across their entire facade. Ms. Alvarez worked quietly alongside me, requesting hospice logs that confirmed my father's care was managed by licensed staff, not by Tiffany, and she even dug into the notary journal, which revealed more discrepancies. But the real jolt came when a courthouse clerk, a friend of hers, whispered about an annulment from years ago tied to a woman with Tiffany's exact birthday, but registered under a different last name. And though the records were sealed, the mere hint that Tiffany had left behind another identity told me we weren't dealing with a one-time slip, but with a pattern of deception. And while my heart still broke each time I folded one of Dad's shirts or caught sight of his old fishing hat hanging by the door, I also felt myself growing steadier, because grief had started to share its space with something else, a determination that hummed through my veins like quiet electricity. By the time Ms. Alvarez scheduled the official mediation at the courthouse, timed deliberately on the same day the community legal clinic would fill the halls with volunteers and locals seeking advice, I realized the stage was being set not just for a private reckoning, but for something far more public. Because Tiffany's greatest weapon had always been her brazen confidence, her smug ability to sneer in full daylight without fear of being challenged. But that confidence was about to collapse in the one place where paper tells louder truths than mouths ever can. And as I tucked the thickening envelope of evidence into my bag, I smiled at the irony that they had started this battle with paper, thinking it was their shield, but paper was about to become the sword that cut them down. On the morning before the mediation, I drove out to the dock, the same weathered boards where my father had taught me how to bait a hook and listen to the rhythm of the tide, and I sat there with my legs dangling over the water, breathing in the salt and the soft smell of river grass, and I let myself finally speak out loud to him, because grief has a way of silencing you until you nearly choke on your own thoughts. And I told him I was scared, that I didn't know how this would end, that some nights I still woke up feeling as though Tiffany's smirk was leaning over my bed, but I also told him I was trying, that I had gathered the papers, found the holes, and leaned on the kindness of Ms. Alvarez. And as the sun broke through the clouds and painted the water gold, I felt as though his presence settled beside me, quiet and steady, reminding me that courage doesn't mean the absence of fear. It means moving forward even while your hands still tremble. That moment by the dock gave me something I hadn't felt in months, a handhold against the storm, and as I drove back home with the windows down and the wind tugging at my hair, I realized how important it was to keep going even when you don't know if the path is clear, and that thought made me think of all of you listening to my story, because in so many ways, your presence is the handhold I need too, the quiet reassurance that these stories matter, that my voice reaches someone who understands what it feels like to be underestimated or pushed aside. And so, from my heart, I want to say this. If you're still with me, if you've walked through this journey of grief and fight alongside me, your support is the reason I can keep telling stories like this. And a simple like or a kind comment, even a few words, means more than you know, because it isn't just numbers on a screen, it's proof that voices like ours deserve to be heard. When I returned home that afternoon, I carried the thick folder of evidence to the table, setting it down as though it were both a burden and a blessing. And I spent hours reviewing every page again, not because I doubted the case, but because I wanted to be so familiar with it that Tiffany's lies could never rattle me. And each time I caught sight of Mark's shaky R or Tiffany's overlapping timelines, I whispered to myself that I was ready. Though in truth, part of me still wondered if they would find some way to twist out of accountability, because liars often do. But then I remembered Ms. Alvarez's calm assurance, the way she had smiled when she told me that names can change, but fingerprints of fraud always remain, and her certainty became my anchor, reminding me that preparation is the best antidote to fear, and that quiet persistence is louder than the most aggressive laughter. That evening, as the marsh reflected the orange and pink hues of sunset, I stood on the porch where Tiffany had once mocked me, and I breathed in the cool air, and instead of hearing her laughter echoing through my mind, I heard my own steady breathing, calm and measured, and I realized that even though tomorrow would bring confrontation, I no longer felt like prey waiting for the predator's strike. I felt like someone who had sharpened her tools, steadied her hands, and reclaimed the ground beneath her feet. And in that calm, I allowed myself a small smile, not of triumph, not yet, but of faith that storms always pass, and that those who build on lies will always see their walls collapse. And I whispered to myself the words my father had often used when things felt heavy, "Steady now." And with that, I closed the door behind me and prepared to face the unraveling of Tiffany's false empire. The courthouse mediation room wasn't grand, just 4 glass walls and a long wooden table. But that day, it felt like the stage for a play I already knew the ending to. And as I walked in with Ms. Alvarez at my side, my folder pressed tightly against my chest, I could feel the eyes of people passing in the hallway lingering, because the community legal clinic was in session, and the building buzzed with neighbors and volunteers, a background audience that neither Tiffany nor Mark had expected. And as I took my seat, I reminded myself that sometimes justice doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs daylight. And there was plenty of daylight streaming through those glass panes to make sure nothing could hide. Tiffany arrived first, her heels clicking like gunshots across the tile floor, her perfume spilling into the air as though she wanted to announce her presence before she even entered. And when she sat down across from me, she wore the same smirk from my porch, a look rehearsed to suggest confidence but betraying just a flicker of nerves around her eyes, while Mark shuffled in behind her, avoiding my gaze with the practiced cowardice of a man who knew what was coming but didn't dare admit it even to himself. The mediator greeted us with polite neutrality, setting a folder on the table and reminding us of the process, but I barely heard the words, because all my focus was on the thick envelope that Miss Alvarez placed calmly on the table between us, her hands steady as if she were setting down nothing more than a grocery list. Though I knew, and Tiffany soon would know, that the contents of that envelope carried the weight of a storm. And when Tiffany leaned back in her chair, tossing her hair with exaggerated indifference, I caught myself noting every detail, the tapping of her manicured nails, the way she glanced at Mark as if to reassure herself that their lies were still holding. And I held my silence, letting the anticipation coil tighter, because silence is sometimes the most powerful weapon when arrogance fills the room. And Tiffany, mistaking my quiet for weakness, leaned forward with a chuckle that grated like sandpaper and told the mediator that she and her husband were ready to settle quickly if I simply agreed to vacate the house within 30 days. Her words almost identical to the threats she had emailed weeks before, and the absurdity of her confidence nearly made me laugh out loud. But it wasn't laughter that followed. It was the quiet unsealing of truth, because Miss Alvarez opened the envelope and began laying out the evidence one page at a time with the deliberate care of someone setting a fine table. First, the caregiving invoices mismatched against Tiffany's own social media posts from Miami and Atlanta. Then the statement from the retired doctor confirming he hadn't practiced in years. Then the hospice logs signed by staff who had been present each day, each sheet a small strike against their carefully built tower of lies. And as the pile of evidence grew, Tiffany's smirk faltered just slightly, her lips tightening into something more rigid. And when Ms. Alvarez produced the notary journal, a record showing Tiffany notarizing a document in another county at the exact hour she claimed to be providing bedside care, the room shifted, because the mediator raised his eyebrows, and even through the glass I saw people in the hallway pause, their footsteps slowing as they glanced at the growing mountain of proof, the air filling with the quiet tension of a performance turning into a reckoning. For me, the moment of reversal came when I saw Tiffany's eyes flicker toward Mark, a silent plea for reassurance that never came. Because Mark had gone pale, his gaze fixed on the papers as though he were trying to will them back into the envelope, and in that silence I allowed myself a small breath of satisfaction, remembering every tear I had swallowed alone in my kitchen. Every night I had lain awake with fear pressing against me, and now here they sat, exposed in the light, unable to laugh, unable to twist, because paper tells the truth louder than mouths ever can. And as Ms. Alvarez circled the identical signatures with the faint printer margin flaw, her pen tapping softly like a final nail in a coffin, I knew the unraveling had begun in earnest, and that no smirk, no laughter, and no arrogance could stitch their lies back together. The room grew heavier with each page Ms. Alvarez slid across the table, and though Tiffany tried to maintain her posture, that familiar tilt of her chin and the forced arch of her brows, I saw her smirk begin to collapse in slow motion, like ice cracking across a pond, beautiful in its confidence one second and fractured beyond repair the next. Because the moment Ms. Alvarez presented the certified copy of my father's no contest clause, complete with his signature and the notary's seal, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet, and Tiffany, who had strutted in with laughter on her lips, now shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes darting between the mediator and the growing crowd of faces gathering outside the glass, neighbors and strangers alike pausing mid-step to watch a woman who thought herself untouchable, suddenly realized that her own arrogance had walked her straight into a wall. She let out a short laugh, brittle and sharp, the kind of sound a person makes when they're trying to convince everyone else that nothing is wrong, but it cracked at the edges. And when Ms. Alvarez followed the clause with a draft referral to the district attorney detailing the suspected forgery and false claims, Tiffany's laugh died altogether, replaced by a strained silence so thick that I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock and even the shallow rhythm of Mark's breathing, and the irony of it struck me so hard I nearly smiled, because Tiffany had always treated paperwork as her weapon, something she could twist into power, but here, under the sunlight and in front of witnesses, paper had turned traitor, every page cutting away at the mask she had worn with such confidence. The mediator adjusted his glasses, visibly uncomfortable now, because he knew what it meant when a case carried not just civil consequences, but criminal weight. And as Tiffany reached for Mark's arm, seeking support, he recoiled almost instinctively, his face pale and his hands trembling, and the weakness in him became another kind of humiliation, because whatever bravado he once carried was gone, replaced by the look of a man who realized that his choices had led him not just into shame, but into real jeopardy, and through the glass, whispers spread in the hallway like wind through tall grass, people murmuring as the story unfolded without needing to hear every word, because humiliation carries its own language, and even strangers could read Tiffany's frozen expression and Mark's crumbling composure. Then came the final twist, the one that turned Tiffany's smirk into something closer to a scream without sound, because Ms. Alvarez placed on the table a set of public records showing that Tiffany's previous marriage had never been fully dissolved at the time she married Mark. a legal bigamy issue that voided her standing and opened questions about tax filings, insurance benefits, and every financial deal she had touched under her current name, and in that instant the last shred of her confidence shattered, her shoulders slumping, her lips parting but no words coming out, while Mark sat there like a man waiting for a sentence he already knew would be harsh. And for me, watching from across the table, it felt like the tide had finally turned, because the woman who once laughed in my face now sat exposed, stripped of her smirk, her laughter, and her false authority, frozen by the weight of truth she could no longer outrun. The silence that followed the revelation of Tiffany's bigamy was thick enough to cut, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I no longer felt like the one cornered, because the shift in the room was undeniable, a current flowing away from me and sweeping directly toward them. And even the mediator, who had worked so hard to remain neutral, now spoke in a clipped tone, declaring that their claim could no longer stand and must be withdrawn immediately, his words falling like a gavel even before a court had the chance to strike one. And as I sat there with my hands folded neatly in front of me, I felt the strangest calm settle over me. Not triumph yet, but the solid weight of knowing the ground beneath my feet was finally mine again. Ms. Alvarez slid a final document across the table, a proposed settlement that required Tiffany and Mark to sign a full retraction of their claims, reimburse the estate's legal fees, and agree never to pursue the matter again under penalty of further action. And though Tiffany tried to gather enough breath to protest, Mark's voice broke first, a hoarse whisper, admitting they could not afford the costs already stacked against them. His tone, that of a man whose bravado had been stripped clean, and when Ms. Alvarez gently explained that failure to sign would only lead to liens and further exposure, he lowered his head in resignation, his once cocky shoulders now slumped like a boy caught cheating at a game. And in that moment, I realized the fight had ended, not with my anger, but with their surrender. The contrast was so sharp it nearly stole my breath, because I thought back to the day on my porch when Tiffany had laughed in my face, telling me to pack my things as if I were a tenant in my own home. And I remembered how small and powerless I had felt, clinging to politeness when all I wanted was to scream. And yet here I was now, steady and composed, dictating terms not out of cruelty but out of justice. And the satisfaction wasn't in their humiliation, but in the restoration of balance, in knowing that decency backed by patience had won the day. And for the first time in months, I felt lightness in my chest, the kind that comes when the storm begins to clear and you realize you survived not by accident, but by endurance. As the mediator gathered the signed documents and the envelope of evidence was tucked neatly away, I glanced across the table and thought for half a second about offering them the leftover banana bread from my freezer, the same bread Tiffany had once refused with disdain. Because in my world, food is a language of closure. But I decided against it, not out of bitterness, but because some lessons are better left unsweetened. And as I rose from my chair, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt, I felt taller than I had in years, not because the room had changed, but because I had, and with each step toward the door I carried the quiet knowledge that weakness and strength often look the same from the outside. Polite words, steady hands, calm silence, until the moment comes when the tide turns, and then the difference is everything. The news did not arrive with fanfare or breaking headlines, but with the slow certainty of whispers that weave themselves into every corner of a small town, and in Savannah, where everyone knows the shade of their neighbor's curtains and the exact day the bakery changes its pie menu, whispers travel faster than the tide itself. And before I had time to breathe, the story of Tiffany's humiliation had become common knowledge, tucked between casual remarks about the weather and the price of gas, And while the HOA newsletter made only a discreet mention about withdrawn claims regarding the Lawson estate, those few words carried enough weight to spark conversations over fences, in church parking lots, and across grocery aisles until it seemed that the whole community knew the truth, or at least the heart of it. And for the first time in weeks, I walked into the store without lowering my head, greeted not by pity but by nods of recognition, neighbors holding my gaze with the quiet affirmation that justice, even when it moves slowly, eventually makes its way home. For Tiffany and Mark, the consequences spread like cracks across a frozen lake, visible and unstoppable, because their entire identity had been built on performance, on the illusion of success and control. And once that veneer was shattered, it did not take long for the collapse to show. And Tiffany's boutique consulting business, the one she had bragged about at every social event, suddenly began to wither as clients slipped away, inventing polite excuses about budgets or timing, though everyone knew the truth. And Mark, who had once strutted around the marina with his new boat polished like a trophy, now stood at the edge of the dock watching potential buyers circle with calculating eyes, forced to admit that his pride was nothing more than debt on display, and the humiliation of placing a motivated seller sign on what he had called his greatest achievement cut him deeper than any courtroom ruling ever could, because pride is fragile, and reputations crumble quicker than wood left out in the salt air. The unraveling grew wider still, stretching beyond gossip and social scorn, because Ms. Alvarez, thorough as ever, passed Tiffany's recycled invoice templates to the volunteers at the legal clinic, and those volunteers, armed with fresh eyes and the patience of people who had seen every trick before, began connecting dots to other estates Tiffany had touched, smaller families without the resources to fight, and suddenly, what began as a petty attempt to push me from my home bloomed into a pattern of fraud stretching across county lines, a thread of deceit leading to authorities who had far sharper teeth than Tiffany had ever anticipated. And while I had never asked for her to be pursued beyond what she had done to me, I found myself quietly satisfied, knowing that the consequences of her arrogance were no longer mine to deliver. Because justice has a way of catching up with those who think themselves untouchable, and the quiet machinery of law was already in motion. For me, life began to tilt back towards something resembling normal, though normal after grief is never the same as before. And I found solace in reopening Dad's bait shop 2 days a week, not for money, but for memory, because the scent of fresh wood shavings, the sight of old hooks neatly arranged in glass jars, and the hum of the river just beyond the door stitched my heart back together in ways I hadn't realized I needed. And soon neighbors began stopping by, sometimes to buy minnows, sometimes simply to sit on the bench outside and share a story, their company a reminder that I was never as alone as Tiffany had hoped to make me feel. And as I sat behind the counter balancing a ledger Dad had once written in, I realized that true justice is not just about punishments delivered, but about the restoration of peace, the return of dignity, and the sweet certainty that no matter how loud lies may sound in the beginning, they cannot echo forever, because the truth, quiet and steady, always finds its way to the surface. The first detonation had shaken Tiffany and Mark's world by tearing away their fraudulent claim and exposing them in front of the community. But the second struck even harder because it came quietly, from the very paper they had mocked, a clause in my father's trust that seemed harmless until it bloomed like a trap beneath their feet. The no contest clause, which they dismissed as legal filler, turned into the very blade that cut their last tie to any shred of inheritance, because by filing a false claim, they had forfeited even the modest goodwill bequest my father had left for Mark, a small gesture meant to soften old bitterness and allow him some dignity despite their divorce. That clause turned generosity into ashes, and the cruel irony was impossible to miss. In chasing what was never theirs, they lost what little was freely given. To me, it felt like poetic justice, the kind of reversal that no amount of arrogance could overcome, because greed has a way of devouring its own harvest. Savannah is not a place where secrets stay buried, and though the courthouse handled the matter discreetly, the second wave of humiliation rolled into the open during the annual fundraiser for the hospice that had cared for my father. The hall was filled with neighbors in their Sunday best, tables lined with casseroles and pies, and the atmosphere buzzing with raffle tickets and good intentions. When Ms. Alvarez rose from her seat and announced, in her calm, steady voice, that she was donating her entire legal fee in my father's memory to the very hospice Tiffany had falsely claimed to serve in her invoices, the room erupted in applause that echoed against the walls. My name was spoken with respect, my father's memory honored, and Tiffany, sitting stiffly at the back, seemed to shrink in her chair, her face tightening as though each clap were a slap, until she finally slipped on her oversized sunglasses, hiding behind them though we were indoors, and left quietly through a side exit. She had always believed she thrived in public settings, smirking and laughing loudly for attention, but now she discovered that public eyes can cut sharper than knives when the truth is out. The aftermath for me was not about savoring her downfall, but about reclaiming my own ground. And I turned back to the bait shop with renewed purpose, reopening it not as a business venture, but as a living memory of my father. The wooden counter still bore the dents of his tools, the walls smelled faintly of sawdust and salt, and neighbors who once came only for hooks and minnows began stopping by just to sit, share coffee, and talk about life by the river. In those conversations, I realized that healing often comes not in great victories, but in the return of small rituals. Counting change, sharpening pencils for the ledger, listening to the water lap against the dock. Inspired by the ordeal I had endured, I started hosting small evening workshops called Paper Tells the Truth, showing caregivers and families how to document expenses, keep receipts, and guard themselves against fraud. At first, only a handful of people attended, but word spread, and soon the room was filled with neighbors eager to learn, each nod and grateful smile becoming another quiet triumph that turned my pain into protection for others, a transformation that felt far sweeter than revenge ever could. Just when I thought the storm had fully cleared, another envelope arrived in my mailbox, its corners worn and its ink slightly smudged, but my father's handwriting unmistakable on the front. Postmarked months earlier, delayed by some bureaucratic shuffle, it felt like a gift arriving at exactly the right moment. I carried it inside and sat at the same kitchen table where so much of this battle had played out, my hands trembling as I opened it. Inside was a letter written in his steady hand, brief but profound, reminding me that fairness does not always arrive with noise, that sometimes it simply stands tall, patient and unwavering, until the lies around it collapse. As I read, tears streamed down my cheeks, not just from sorrow, but from the overwhelming certainty that he had trusted me to carry his lessons forward, that he knew I had more strength than I believed. In that moment, the circle felt complete. Tiffany and Mark had been undone by their own greed. My father's wisdom had carried me through, and my life had shifted from battle back to peace. The letter was his final word, a quiet blessing, and it became the anchor that told me justice had not only been served, it had been witnessed, remembered, and sealed in love. When the dust finally settled and the courthouse files were closed, what remained was not noise but silence, the kind of silence that felt cleansing rather than empty. And for the first time since my father's passing, I could breathe without the weight of fear pressing on my chest. I kept the house just as it was, the porch still shaded by ferns, the bait shop smelling faintly of river and wood, and I planted a rosemary bush near the steps where Tiffany had once stood smirking. Because rosemary is for remembrance and strength, and I wanted something living to mark that space, something that would grow greener with each passing year instead of rotting like the bitterness she had tried to leave behind. Each time I brushed my hand against its fragrant leaves, I felt a small surge of peace, as though I had claimed the ground back with roots deeper than greed could ever reach. Life didn't return to what it had been before. Grief never allows for that, but it unfolded into something gentler, steadier, and more meaningful. I learned to enjoy the slow rhythm of mornings again, brewing coffee not as armor against dread but as a simple pleasure, and I welcomed neighbors who stopped by the bait shop to sit and talk, turning the little store into a gathering place rather than just a business. Some days I shared stories about my father, and other days I listened to theirs, realizing that loss, resilience, and small victories weave through every family, and that connection itself is a form of healing. I even laughed again, really laughed, not the brittle sound of someone covering pain, but the full, unguarded kind that shakes your shoulders. And each time I did, I thought of how Tiffany had tried to take even that from me, and how sweet it was that she failed. The workshops I started, teaching others how to guard themselves against fraud and to trust the quiet strength of paper, became more than just a side project. They became my mission, a way of turning my experience into protection for others. People brought boxes of old bills, receipts, and letters, and together we sifted through them, and I watched their eyes widen as they realized how much power they held in their own hands once they knew what to look for. I saw widows relax as they understood they weren't defenseless, and families leave with binders organized and confidence restored. And each time I closed a session, I silently thanked Tiffany for one thing, for teaching me that even the ugliest battles can produce tools to defend others. Her cruelty had planted the seed of my strength, and though she would never recognize it, that was her final failure. As for the moral, it was simple and clear, the kind of truth that doesn't need embellishment. Never mistake kindness for weakness, and never mistake paperwork for dullness, because both can save a life and restore dignity. Justice doesn't always shout or roar. Sometimes it arrives in a plain envelope, steady and undeniable. And when it does, it leaves behind not just victory, but peace. These days, when I sit on my porch with a cup of coffee and the rosemary brushing against my arm, I remind myself that revenge doesn't have to be loud to be complete, and I joke with my neighbors that the only two things I trust without hesitation are notarized affidavits and well-buttered casseroles, and we laugh together, because laughter shared is the sweetest proof that storms pass and balance always returns. In the end, the smirk is gone, the laughter that mocked me silenced, and what remains is stronger. Love, memory, and the quiet certainty that goodness, though tested, always finds its way home. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you from the bottom of my heart. It truly means the world. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. So please, if this touched you, leave me a little like, drop a comment to share what you felt or even just where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story. Every click, every word from you is a reminder that I'm not telling these stories alone. We're building them together.